Ryan Mallory's quiet suburban life is shattered when fake HOA enforcers taser his elderly father, believing him to be an easy target. The mastermind behind this attack, Thomas Radley, a wealthy developer, has been using intimidation to seize homes for his profit. But he underestimated the Mallorys. What he didn't know was that Robert Mallory wasn't just any old man. He was a four-star general, and his family wasn't to be messed with. But listen to how this drama turns, and how justice, in the end, was served in a way no one saw coming. Part 1. Shocking Injustice. It was one of those rare, quiet afternoons when everything seemed to slow down. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of the suburban neighborhood. Ryan Mallory had just returned home after a grueling day at the office. His mind was still buzzing with legal jargon, but at least now he could retreat into the comfort of his home. His wife, Megan, was in the kitchen, the rhythmic clink of ceramic plates filling the air as she unpacked groceries. Their two children were out playing in the yard, the faint sound of their laughter drifting through the open windows. It was peaceful, serene, even idyllic. But then the doorbell rang. Ryan froze, his body instinctively tensing at the sound. It wasn't the usual visitor. The ring was sharper, more insistent. Something about it felt wrong, like a storm on the horizon, barely perceptible, but undeniable. Megan, ever the gracious hostess, made her way to the door, still carrying a bag of fresh produce. Ryan, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach, stepped into the foyer just as she opened the door. Two men stood there. Their uniforms were neat, crisp, too perfect to be anything but official. One of them was taller than the other, with a sharp jawline and eyes that never seemed to blink. The other, shorter, had a hard-set expression, his eyes flicking back and forth as if sizing up the situation. "Good afternoon," the taller man said in a voice that was too calm, too composed for the moment. He flashed a badge, the gleaming metal catching the light. "We need to discuss an issue regarding your property. It seems you've violated HOA rules." Ryan stepped forward, the words sinking into him like lead. HOA rules. They had just moved into this house 6 months ago. Everything had been fine. They'd kept the lawn manicured, their garbage cans tucked neatly away, the exterior pristine. What could they possibly have done wrong? "What rules?" Ryan asked, the question coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. His lawyer's mind was already racing, trying to find any possible legal misstep. Megan, sensing his growing frustration, caught his hand gently, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The man didn't seem to notice. "We'll have to assess the situation more thoroughly," he said dismissively, like this was all just routine, another task to check off a list. Before Ryan could respond, the shorter man took a sudden step forward. His movements were swift and practiced, and before anyone could react, he was inside, moving past Megan and toward the living room. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he watched in disbelief. "Wait, what are you—" Ryan began, his words cutting off as the man grabbed his elderly father, Robert Mallory, who had been sitting on the couch, absorbed in a news report on TV. Robert Mallory was a man of dignity, of experience, but time had taken its toll. At over 75 years old, his once sturdy frame had withered, the gray in his hair a testament to decades of life lived with purpose. He moved slowly now, a quiet shadow of the man he had once been. But still there was strength in him, a strength that had carried him through a life of service, both to his country and his family. The younger man, however, didn't care. He grabbed Robert's arm with a force that made Ryan's blood run cold, yanking him toward the door as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. "Hey!" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking with the sudden surge of anger. "What are you doing?" His father, confused and frail, tried to resist, but the man was too strong. They reached the porch, and Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as the man pushed his father down into the chair, holding him there as he pulled out something from his belt. A taser. "Stop! What are you doing?" Ryan's voice broke the stillness of the moment, but it was too late. Before he could even reach them, the younger man pressed the taser to Robert's chest, and the sharp crackle of electricity filled the air. Ryan could only watch in horror as his father jerked violently, the force of the jolt hitting his fragile body. Megan screamed, her voice raw with terror. Ryan's legs went weak, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His father's eyes, wide with confusion and pain, locked onto his, and the sight was enough to stop his heart. "Let him go!" Ryan shouted again, rushing forward, but the man stood firm, not even flinching at the outburst. "You'll have to settle this with the HOA board," he said, his voice indifferent, like he was giving them a notice for a parking violation. Ryan reached for his father, his hands trembling as he helped him up. Robert, shaking but still breathing, looked at his son, his gaze filled with something Ryan couldn't name, but it wasn't fear. It was something stronger. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, his voice thick with emotion. Robert nodded, but his voice was weak. "I'll be fine, son." Ryan felt the rage burn through him, sharper and more focused than anything he had ever felt in his life. This wasn't just an assault on his father, it was an attack on his family, on their dignity, on everything they had worked for. The two men turned, unfazed by the chaos they had caused. With cold, dazzled, mechanical steps, they made their way back down the front steps and onto the sidewalk, disappearing as quickly as they had come, leaving only the silence in their wake. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, and for the first time in years, Ryan felt completely and utterly powerless. Ryan stood frozen, his pulse roaring in his ears. His father, Robert Mallory, was slumped against the porch, gasping for breath, his frail chest heaving with each shallow intake of air. The shock of the taser still seemed to ripple through his body, his skin twitching involuntarily. Ryan knelt beside him, heart pounding as he placed a hand on his father's shoulder. The world felt like it was closing in on him. "Dad, are you okay?" Ryan's voice was barely a whisper, the words barely leaving his throat. Robert's eyelids fluttered open, his old eyes, still sharp, focused on Ryan, but there was a weariness to them, an exhaustion deeper than physical pain. "I'm fine, son," he rasped, his voice shaky but determined. Just help me up." Ryan's hands trembled as he helped Robert to his feet, his mind racing in a storm of confusion and anger. But beneath it all, a cold realization was beginning to settle in, a realization that was both terrifying and enlightening. The audacity of it, the cruelty. Who would do this? The HOA? No. This was never about the rules. It wasn't just some bureaucratic oversight. No. This was personal. It was a blatant, calculated attack on his family. A line crossed in a way Ryan couldn't yet fully comprehend. He barely noticed when Megan appeared at his side, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't said a word since the men had left, but the silence between them was deafening. Ryan quickly pulled out his phone and dialed the police. His hands shook as he spoke, trying to stay calm, trying to make sense of the chaos. It took only minutes for the squad car to arrive, its sirens barely audible over the thick silence that had descended on the house. The officers came, and Ryan was desperate for answers. He told them everything, the men in uniforms, the tasering, the fear. The police listened, taking notes, but their expressions were distant, unfazed. They asked the usual questions, making polite inquiries about possible suspects and any video footage they could gather. But when they asked where the perpetrators had gone, Ryan had no answer. The two men had vanished into the labyrinth of quiet suburban streets, leaving no trace behind, no license plate, no sign of where they had come from. Nothing. "You'll hear from us," one officer finally said, but even as he spoke, Ryan could sense the words were hollow. The police had nothing to act on. No charges could be filed. The men had disappeared as if they were ghosts, vanishing without a trace. It was the most frustrating feeling Ryan had ever experienced. Helplessness. That night, as darkness fell over the quiet house, Ryan couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the horror of the afternoon, his father being assaulted, Megan's horrified scream, the cold, indifferent faces of the men in uniform. Over and over, the images ran through his mind like a twisted loop, and the anger burned in his chest. But then something happened. something that stopped him cold. In the midst of the chaos, a truth so simple yet so profound hit him like a freight train. Robert Mallory wasn't just some retired soldier, some old man with a few decades of military service behind him. Ryan had always known his father had a storied past, but in that moment, everything clicked. His father had never shared much about his time in service, not the details, not the intricacies of what he had done or who he had become. It was never something Ryan asked about. It was just always there, unspoken, like an invisible force that hovered over them. But now, with the brutal memory of the taser still fresh in his mind, the truth was undeniable. Robert Mallory was a 4-star general. The weight of those words crushed him. His father, his frail, elderly father, wasn't just any retired military man. No, this was a man who had led entire divisions, a man who had commanded the respect of the highest echelons of the military, a man whose reputation carried the weight of history itself. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, his mind spinning. He stared at the darkened window, trying to make sense of it all. The men who had come to his house had no idea who they were dealing with. They hadn't just assaulted a vulnerable old man. They had attacked someone who had stood on the front lines, who had led soldiers through the harshest conditions, who had earned the kind of respect that could silence a room full of generals with just a glance. The audacity of the attack, now it made sense. They had no idea what they had done, and that was the thing that kept him up all night. The men in those uniforms hadn't known the man they'd picked a fight with. They didn't know that Robert Mallory's quiet strength wasn't just in his bones, but in his blood. They hadn't seen the battles he had fought, the wars he had won, the lives he had shaped. Ryan's fists clenched in the dark. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The questions that haunted him earlier now had a clear target. Why? Why had these men come to his house? What did they want from them? And what did the HOA have to do with it? The rules no longer mattered. Ryan Mallory was no longer just an attorney defending his family. He was the son of a 4-star general, and this wasn't some petty dispute. It was war. And this time, he wasn't going to let them win. Ryan sat at his kitchen table, his fingers curling into fists as he sifted through the stack of papers in front of him. The weight of the day's events, his father's assault, the unanswered questions, the creeping feeling that someone was toying with his family, settled heavily on his chest. His mind spun in tight circles, each thought more volatile than the last. Who would do this? The answer seemed elusive, and it gnawed at him. Who would have the audacity to send fake enforcers to his home? Why target his father? A retired general, a man of honor and dignity. What kind of coward would hide behind a false badge and harm an elderly man without consequence? The anger was consuming. It burned in his veins like wildfire, but under it a deeper, more suffocating feeling took hold. This wasn't just an attack on his father. This was an attack on his family, his home. Ryan's phone buzzed, a simple sound that sliced through the thick silence. He didn't need to look at the caller ID. He knew who it was. It was time to get to work. He called in every favor he had, old friends from his days as an attorney, military contacts his father had trusted. His mind was sharp, methodical, as he sifted through records and contacted everyone who might have any lead, no matter how small. It was the only way to make sense of the chaos that had turned their world upside down. And then it hit him, the most chilling discovery. The men who had come to his door, the ones who had brutalized his father, they weren't even affiliated with the HOA. They weren't enforcers. They were nothing but hired thugs, mercenaries, people with no allegiance, no legitimate purpose. They didn't belong to any association or law enforcement agency. They were just tools, hired by someone with the resources and the audacity to target a family like his. His blood boiled. Who could possibly be behind this? Ryan knew he couldn't let this go. The stakes had just gotten much higher. No longer was this about petty neighborhood politics or HOA bylaws. This was about something far more sinister, something personal. Someone had crossed a line, and now they would pay. He leaned back in his chair, his mind working in overdrive. Who would hire mercenaries to intimidate his family? There was only one place left to turn: his father's old contacts. Ryan knew he couldn't do this alone. He called the men his father had fought alongside, military veterans who had served under Robert Mallory during his time in the service. These men weren't just soldiers, they were family, and they understood loyalty better than anyone. Within hours, Ryan had a team of his father's former comrades working alongside him. They dug into the mystery with relentless determination. They pored over surveillance footage, piecing together fragmented details of the fake enforcers' movements. With every passing minute, they grew closer to uncovering the truth. Ryan wasn't going to rest until he knew who was behind the attack on his father. He sat across from one of his father's old contacts in a dimly lit bar, the kind of place where conversations were hushed and business was done in the shadows. His eyes were tired, but his resolve was clear. Every lead, every scrap of information brought them closer to the people who had orchestrated this attack. And then, as Ryan took a slow sip of his drink, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. It was one of the men on the inside team. His heart skipped a beat. "Ryan," the voice on the other end of the line was low, grim. "We've got a name." Ryan leaned forward, his breath catching in his chest. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for, the lead that would unravel everything. "Who is it?" Ryan's voice was sharp, all business now. Every ounce of his focus was trained on the phone, on the man's words. There was a brief pause before the voice spoke again, the name slipping out like a dagger through the quiet. "Thomas Radley." Ryan's mind reeled. The name meant nothing to him at first, but as the details of Radley's connections began to fill in, the pieces clicked together like a puzzle falling into place. Thomas Radley wasn't just some nameless figure. He was connected to powerful forces, a man with influence who had the resources to make such an attack happen, a man who would stop at nothing to control the people around him. Ryan's grip tightened around the phone. This wasn't just a man who had hurt his family. This was a man who would pay. It had taken weeks of relentless investigation, phone calls, and sleepless nights, but at last, Ryan and his team had tracked down the mastermind behind the fake HOA enforcers. And as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the truth was more unsettling than Ryan had imagined. Thomas Radley, the man responsible for orchestrating the attack on his father and family, was no small player. He was a wealthy developer, a man whose influence stretched deep into the community. His mansion, perched high on the hill like a monument to his power, reflected the kind of arrogance only wealth and untouchable status could breed. He had been using the HOA rules as a front, sending out hired thugs to intimidate homeowners, hoping to scare them into selling their properties for a fraction of their worth, all so he could develop the land for his own profit. But now, standing at the edge of the storm he had created, Radley was about to realize that no amount of money or influence could protect him from the consequences of his actions. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the massive gates of Radley's estate. His father, Robert Mallory, walked beside him, steady as ever despite his age, every bit the man he had been in his prime. In the light of the setting sun, Robert's silhouette was a reminder of a history built on courage and honor. The man was a warrior, one who had served his country and now was about to avenge his family. The driveway curved toward the mansion, and at the front door, Thomas Radley stood, his face momentarily betraying confusion, as he saw Ryan and Robert approach. Ryan's voice was calm, measured, but there was a steel edge to it that made Radley's eyes widen. "Mr. Bradford," he said, his words deliberate, his resolve firm, "you don't know who you've messed with." Before Radley could even respond, Robert Mallory took a step forward. The man was over 70, but in that moment he radiated a force that made the air seem to thicken. His voice, quiet but laced with authority, broke through the tense silence like a crack of thunder. "You assaulted my son and my family." Robert's words were deliberate, cold as ice. "And you did it thinking I was just some old man." Radley, still standing in the doorway, looked like he had been struck by a wave of shock. He stammered, his usual composure slipping as he tried to regain control of the situation. But the moment was slipping away from him. Ryan could feel the heat of his anger slowly fading into a quiet, overwhelming satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done, about holding a man who thought he was untouchable accountable for his actions. As if on cue, the sirens of approaching police cruisers echoed down the long driveway. Radley's face drained of color as he looked back over his shoulder, realizing too late that his empire was crumbling before his eyes. Within moments, uniformed officers swarmed the front of the mansion, their presence a stark contrast to the false authority Radley had relied on for so long. The fake enforcers, the hired thugs, were quickly rounded up and placed in cuffs, their identities exposed, their roles in Radley's corrupt scheme unraveled. Radley, for all his power and influence, was now nothing more than a criminal being arrested on his own doorstep. The reality of the situation settled in. The man who had caused so much pain was finally facing the music. Ryan's breath caught in his chest as he turned to his father. The old soldier, the retired general, looked at him with something akin to pride in his eyes. The anger that had once consumed Ryan now felt distant, replaced by a deep sense of calm satisfaction. The battle had been fought, and the good had won. Justice had been restored. "You did good, Dad," Ryan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Robert Mallory, the 4-star general, gave a small but knowing smile. He reached out, patting his son's shoulder. "No one touches my family," he said, his voice low but filled with the weight of experience. And with that, Ryan knew that their world, fractured for a time, was whole again. The anger, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all behind them now. The man who had wronged them was being led away in handcuffs, and the justice that had seemed so out of reach was now firmly within their grasp.